Hello and welcome to another Tippling Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is exciting. I've been so absorbed in the whole Ukraine war stuff that I haven't been giving enough love and attention to philosophy and in our case, the natural world today without God, but we'll be mentioning that. This is not going to be about the Ukraine war. So if you're here for that, this ain't your bag. This is morality. This is philosophy. This is science. So we're going to be looking at whether what we can understand in morality from a naturalistic point of view. And I have with me Austin Johnson. And Austin Johnson, if you don't remember him, he was with me recently where we talked about his kind of journey and then evolution. He's a evolutionary sort of biologist or a professor thereof. And he is here to give us his insights in that kind of dimension to what we can make of morality. So welcome, Austin. Thank you for coming on. I know you're not feeling particularly well today, so we might not have a hugely long discussion, but we'll hopefully have a punchy discussion.
Right, yeah. So apologies to everybody. I've come down with a little cold, so might be sniffling a little bit, but yeah, we'll get through it. It'll be okay. So
Good stuff. Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that as naturalists, which is that we believe that the natural world is all there is, right? Then everything that we see around us, everything that we experience, every phenomenon of the world is the universe is explained within that naturalistic framework, right? And I know naturalism is arguably difficult to define, as is supernaturalism, but as far as we understand it now, like this is what we've got. And so when we talk about morality, it has to be explicable within the natural world that we live in. Is that something we can agree on?
yeah, definitely.
Good. So then it is a case of, well, okay, what explains how we get things? Well, in terms of biology, that's going to be evolution. Is what doesn't is not what gets us life. That's abiogenesis, which is a whole different thing. But once you've got life, the diversity of life and all the characteristics of life come through evolution, and there are all the pressures of evolution that bring what we have, which is our genetic blueprint and our personalities and everything, what we call our a phenotype coming from our genotype, and that or phenotype comes through, and that's all delivered through the process of evolution. But things like morality, which are these abstract ideas, are possibly a step away from that, or are they not? Are they just part of evolution? That's kind of where we're going to start. Is there anything you want to kind of start the ball rolling with before we get too involved?
Yeah, just to continue on that, I think you've got the right kind of scaling up, right? You start from some of the first life forms that existed on the planet, and over time you get the emergence of biodiversity and complexity, right? Species with developed nervous systems, complex nervous systems, something like humans, for example. And once you get some of those emergent properties like that, something like consciousness, for example, then you can start talking about morality, in terms of what conscious agents think other conscious agents should or shouldn't do, right? So just kind of like an emergent property that you get once evolution has led to the appearance of thinking, reasoning agents like human beings.
So I suppose one of the first things to do is kind of like is to define what morality is. Okay, so morality, as far as I would explain it, well, there are three components in morality. There's something called descriptive morality, which is how people or how moral agents act. It's literally describing what is going on. That is descriptive morality, and actually, we're going to talk quite a bit about that when we talk about the animal kingdom, because they might not be adhering to something called normative morality or prescriptive morality, which is how you should act. So these are kind of moral rules, what kind of moral value system you might be using. And a third aspect of morality is meta ethics, which is the discussion of what is right, what is wrong, what does kind of ought mean, and all the kind of the very technical philosophical language of of morality. So we'll probably dip into a bit of all three at some point. But with that in mind, I suppose what I want to ask you, as you were, and we talked about this in the previous interview with you, that you were someone coming from a religious background, coming out of that, and then doing evolution and teaching that. Has your opinion on morality changed with what you've learned and how you've grown?
Yeah, definitely. I think overall it just has become more refined, because once you abandon theism, then you realize that you actually have to think about it. Right? You have to think about it a lot more. Not to say that there are any theists that think about morality. It's just that um, using theism as a basis for your morality can allow you to be lazy in thinking about morality, right? It doesn't mean every theist necessarily is lazy in thinking about morality, but it allows you to be. And I think for myself personally, coming out of that, then you have to do the heavy lifting of thinking about, okay, some of the kind of fundamental basis of, where things like right actions and wrong actions come from. I had a misguided perception about that. So, what does it actually mean? What do you do going forward, right? How do you reconstruct and think about morality now that you're not trying to ground it in the commands of some supernatural being?
That's really interesting. Something I've talked about quite a lot recently, which is that actually religion does a lot of work for you, a lot of thinking for you. Holy books do thinking for you. This is how you should act. Priests do a lot of work for you. This is how you should act. So you go to church or you read a holy book and you come away thinking, right, I know morality. I've been told what to think. I've been told what to do. So and you just fulfill those orders, if you like. Whereas actually naturalistic philosophy in general is a case of like, I have to build up my worldview from the bottom upwards. I have to build this foundation. How do I do that? And actually there's as you say, there's a lot more thought that goes into it. It's not so lazy. I always reference this book, one of my recent books, Why I Am Atheist and Not a Theist, because it's about building from the ground up your entire worldview, and then somewhere up here is morality, but it's certainly not at the bottom.
Hmm.
And you have to understand what abstract ideas are and all these kind of things before you get there. But anyway, before we do that, uh, let's think about, well, do you want to set out how you understand morality within your worldview, particularly in terms of your expertise with regard to evolution, and how you think it you think evolution can explain its development, if that's correct?
Yeah, the way I look at it is, morality is, I look at it as evaluating the consequences of actions with respect to some goal or value or principle, right? Something along those lines, right? If I think that it is immoral to cause unnecessary suffering to other conscious creatures, I'm going to evaluate my actions or potential actions with respect to that axiom, and that's kind of what morality is on a kind of a foundational level, right? We have some types of goals, values, objectives, and we evaluate actions or potential actions with respect to those goals, values, or objectives, um, and decide if it's something we should do or shouldn't do, or if it's something that's good or bad, depending on that, right? Of course, we also think about people's intentions, things like that. So, not just an action itself, but what did the agent intend on doing? Were they trying to cause harm? Were they trying to do something good? Um, Things like that, right? But it's assessing, thought, behavior, action with respect to some subjective value, right? So, some value that we subjectively decide is right or wrong.
Which is interesting because you already introduced a really difficult, or like the complexity of morality and trying to work out actually a viable moral system, because you take something like consequentialism, which is the idea that morality is obtained or calculated by the consequences to a given action. So it might
Right.
be that I give a homeless person on the side of the road $5, and I say, right, here's $5, and with my consequentialist morality, I give you $5 and you go and spend that, but you go and buy that you spend that on a coffee, and I'm like, that's brilliant. But then maybe a little bit of drugs, $5 is not going to get you a lot, maybe $10, $20. So I give you that, you go and spend it on coffee, but then you buy some drugs and you get into drugs, and then it's like, oh my goodness. So how do I evaluate the what I've done? Do I evaluate it on my intentions that I
Mhm.
intended this to be spent wisely, but you've then done badly. But then you get other complications like, okay, so you go and take that $10, buy some drugs, take up drugs, and then you become a drug addict for 5 years. I think that's terrible. So if I evaluated it on the outcomes, then that's a really bad moral action. But then if you then turn your life around after 5 years and use that kind of experience to then go and teach other people how not to do drugs, and then after 15 years, actually that $10 is amazing. But then he then goes backwards and becomes a mass murderer, and it's like, well, where do you draw the
Mhm.
line of how you evaluate? So the point of me going into all that, I don't really want to go into all that details, is these things are really complicated and they are very nuanced, and it depends how that's just consequentialism, how you set things out. But as far as you are saying, it is evaluating a set against some intentions or goals. Now, from your point of view in evolution, of course, does that mean that you need to have a brain and a mind to be able to evaluate, to be able to predict, to be able to understand these things?
Right. Yeah, I think it does. We look at some of the behaviors of other animal species, right, non-human animals, and from our perspective, we don't tend to judge their behaviors on whether or not that they're moral or immoral, right? They're generally just seen to be non-moral, right, just outside of the realm of morality. It's just the behavior. This animal does this or that thing. If a human gets mauled by a tiger, we don't think that the tiger was behaving immorally. Um, or morally or amorally. It's just non-moral. It's outside of the realm of morality. What makes morality relevant to certain biological organisms is that they have higher brain functions, right? They have um, the ability to reason and to um, simulate the future, right? Think about what the consequences of your potential actions are, right? So, in a social species with advanced cognitive abilities like humans, right, we exist in a social context where we interact with other people. Our actions have consequences, and we're able to generally understand to at least some degree what the consequences of our actions will be. And that's where morality comes into play, right? Somebody says you did something wrong, you knew that this or this bad thing was going to happen or could happen, and you did it anyways without respect to how it made somebody else feel, right? We're capable of understanding the impacts that our actions can have on other people, and so we judge people as having done something moral or immoral based on the decision they chose to make with the available information that they have to them.
So are you saying that morality is a reflection of or correlated with brain function, cognitive function, the ability, knowledge, perhaps as well, uh, the ability to do all these kind of higher functionings? That therefore morality can be on a sliding scale. So moral agency can be on a sliding scale, such that we have
Yep.
children who haven't learned all those things and don't have those functioning yet, but we draw a kind of arbitrary line at kind of 12, 16, 18, somewhere, as to like, now you're moral, now you're going to prison. um
Yep.
uh,
Yep.
and but does that also mean, and I'll be interested from your biological point of view, does that also mean that certain animals do have aspects of morality? So for example, you might have a dog that it knows when it's being naughty. It has like moral intuitions, or is that just you conditioning it? I don't know. Do you think certain animals have aspects of morality?
It's an interesting way of framing it, and I do agree that it is a sliding scale. I mean, we evaluate human actions in that way with respect to age and also things like disabilities or handicaps, right? If somebody has a mental disability, we tend not to hold them as morally responsible if they cause harm or something or hurt somebody, right? We do view those things, as degrees based on someone's mental faculties, how well they were capable of reasoning and understanding the consequences of their actions. With non-human animals, something even like dogs, they've been domesticated for a long time, interact very well with humans. Um, personally, I don't tend to think of their actions as moral or immoral. as well. I don't really tend to look at, I guess, any other non-human animals that way myself. I think you could make a case that it could be some degree of morality. I guess depending on how exactly you view morality or how you define it. But um,
It seems to possibly connected to the idea of personhood, and I know personhood is a
yep.
particularly tricky idea philosophically speaking. I deny it exists, but like it doesn't exist out there. So we construct
Hmm.
what personhood is, and we
Right.
might ascribe rationality. We might ascribe the ability to predict, and then you get people like Franz de Waal or Peter Singer, people who are interested in primatology with great apes and primates, looking at behaviors, looking at animal rights and things like that. So you can possibly accord animal rights, but you can also accord maybe their ability to be. So I wonder, in domestication, I think is a really interesting idea, because if you domesticated a lion, you have these. I've seen like YouTube videos where someone's like rescued a lion cub and it remembers them 10 years later
Hmm.
or whatever, and then you have this great relationship between like a human and a lion, and a sort of domesticated lion, maybe in a safari or something. But then you can imagine it just switching and then just going back to its natural self and having a moment and just
Hmm.
ripping the guy apart, and you're thinking, is that bad? Is that a bad lion? In the way that you
Right.
say that's a bad dog, like you say bad dog to a dog that's done something wrong, and it knows it's done something wrong. So in a sense, it's got this really rudimentary morality. I don't know. These are the kind of things I think about.
Yeah. I think I mean, animals perform behaviors. A lot of those behaviors have a genetic basis. And morality is something that we ascribe to certain behaviors, and so there's going to be a difference between what some people think is a cutoff for what can be considered moral or immoral behavior. Because, at least in my view, I mean, morality it's a construct. It's a way of describing actions that are performed by conscious thinking, reasoning agents with respect to some type of goal or social norm or something like that.
So would you? I don't know if you'd agree with me and with your position. I know you've read Sean Carroll's book, The Big Picture, which is
Hmm.
something I think is a great book, and it really accords
Hmm.
with my position. I think poetic
Yeah.
naturalism he coins it as. But would you say that morality exists out there, like in the
Yeah.
ether? Is
Definitely
it
not.
okay?
Certainly
So
not.
so, because you use the word constructed, so you think it is a constructed thing, which is to say, if all humans died on Earth, or if all sentient creatures died in the universe, there would be no such thing as morality. Is that something you'd agree with?
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. If there are no conscious reasoning agents, there's no morality. It's really just a way of talking about behavior, right? And behavior requires conscious thinking agents to do things, right? So if you don't have those, you don't have morality, right? I definitely don't think that it's real in some ultimate ontological sense, such that it exists, outside of conscious thinking agents.
Right, which is so that's good. We're agreed there. So, what would you do? You think there is? Well, okay. Let's go back. Let's go back to evolution, and let's. What are the sort of pressures? How do you think morality has evolved, or our understanding of morality? How do you think of moral behavior? What are the pressures involved in the development of morality?
Yeah, I think that comes from us being a social species. As humans, we are primates. We lack a lot of traits that, for example, large mammalian predators will have, such as being very strong or agile or having claws or sharp teeth or things like that. But yet we're able to hunt and take down creatures like that, and become extremely populous to the point where we dominate the globe. And we're able to do that by using our brains, right, and working together. And so a key feature of that, and I think the evolution of morality, is the fact that we are a social species and we have to be able to interact and cooperate with one another. And so if you have a population of individuals that needs to cooperate, and if you have a higher fitness, if you're a cooperator, right, that type of thing will tend to proliferate in a population.
So do you think that it conveys an advantage to, for example, us as a species to have morality? Do you think that we wouldn't have survived or in natural selection? You know, I wonder how that's worked with sort of deleterious or advantageous, benign characteristics in our genome, in our phenotype. Like,
Right. I mean, I certainly think that it was an advantage in our lineage to be able to work together, right, and exist with other human beings. Behaviors are phenotypes like anything else and can evolve due to natural selection. And what behavior is advantageous and favored by selection is context dependent, right, on the species um, and where that species finds itself in space and time. I think certainly for the case of human beings, it was definitely advantageous for us to be social and to be able to work together. And in order to be able to do that, we had to have cooperative behaviors and ways of evaluating people's behaviors to be able to identify people who are bluffing or freeloading, right, or people who are being duplicitous, things like that.
absolutely. I would love to. Hopefully this will play, but this is primatologist Franz de Waal, who is really great. Has done lots of fabulous work on this. I want to see. Can you first of all, can you see that?
Yep.
Can you hear it?
So final experiment
Hmm.
that I mentioned.
Okay, so just what I know, this is 2 minutes of our time, but this is really, I think this is really interesting to see, for the viewers to see elements of morality or aspects of morality, because I think there are possibly different aspects of morality, like things like justice. It's very difficult to have morality without a sense of justice, right? And
Hmm.
so here, Francois Wells says we've done some experiments with capuchins, and they exhibit a sense of justice, as he shows here. So I'm just going to play that.
To you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs and with birds and with chimpanzees, but with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, it's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
So anyway, I just thought that that was interesting to show because as he says, it's a very well-known experiment that just shows that here we have capuchins who have a sense of anger at injustice
Hmm.
and also the ability to empathize and the ability possibly to be able to say, hang on, I can put myself in that capuchin's shoes and it's giving what I'm giving and it's getting something better than what I'm getting. This is really unfair, and get really angry. And I
Hmm.
think that's a like if you're talking about evolution giving us the building bricks over time to give us moral behavior, then that is one of those building bricks.
Yep.
Would you be in agreement with that?
Yeah, definitely. And I love that example. I'm familiar with some of Franz de Waal's work, yeah, it is clear to see that some of these behavioral faculties, these cognitive faculties that we have, things of sense of justice, fairness, cooperation, things like that, um, can be present in other species. It's not
Yeah.
necessarily that it has to be found in human beings. In terms of, is it moral, is it immoral? From the perspective of a human, that's where we get into those degrees of morality, and it's hard to say from my perspective that what's going on between um, two monkeys is
Yeah.
moral or immoral. With respect to
Well, I
myself.
think, yeah, I think because
Um,
their abilities, I think there's a lot to be said about language, right? So
hmm.
when you have language, you have the ability to express thoughts, and you have language in your head where you're speaking through stuff. And yeah, we have intuitions and we have feelings that we can experience in our minds. But the complexity that we understand the world, the universe, our lives, and our behaviors uh, are infinitely, you know, expanded or hugely expanded by our ability to be able to put those into words and find the nuances of words.
Hmm.
Whereas, of course, a monkey or a capuchin is not going to be able to do that. There's going to be a lot of intuition going on rather than a lot of absolute understanding of the rational ins and outs of moral behavior.
Right. It might feel a certain way based on some sense data that it takes in and then react, in a state of outrage or something. Um, but, a lot of human morality, I think, is similar to that. People have feelings that arise when they see something take place, and many times they may not be able to articulate why it's right or wrong. They just makes them feel like it's bad, so they say it's bad, right? So I think that's at play within human beings as well, right? There are things that we might have a feeling like is wrong, but when you look at it from a rational perspective and you know and say, well, is it causing harm to anyone, something like that, we can conclude, okay, maybe it's not immoral, even though my gut might tell me that.
Interesting. And there are other, very similar to what you're saying, is that we'll see moral intuitions and then post hoc rationalize afterwards, which is
Yep.
the idea that yeah, okay, I think I know that's wrong, and now I'm going to give a reason why that's wrong. But it's not necessarily that is a guiding reason. You kind of attached it afterwards to the intuition, so it might not be a true reflection of what is wrong about that. We're very good at post hoc rationalizing. Um, and I think that, yeah, and you're right. So these characteristics exist in many animals. I mean, you look at ants and how they cooperate. Use cooperation as one of the words. Ants cooperate exceptionally well, but you wouldn't call them moral at all,
Hmm.
I
Right.
guess. Would you argue that we are meaningfully different? I mean, is it like, are we just elaborating, uh, to a huge degree on our sense data and on things that our brains are just doing? And are we truly moral agents? I guess.
um it's hard to even really say because you know, because of the fact that morality isn't something that necessarily exists prior to humans, and then we can evaluate what we're doing with respect to some objective standard that already exists, right? It's hard to say. We have evolved preferences for certain types of things, ways that we behave, interact, treat each other, things like that. Um, and we evaluate the way that humans act based on some of these preferences, intuitions that we have. And that's generally what people are referring to when they are thinking about if something's moral or not, right? Whether or not people know or like to admit it. Um, that's what a lot of people do, which is why, even if you have, theists, for example, you could have 5 different Christians that could all reach 5 different conclusions on whether or not something is moral or immoral, or to the degree of which it's moral or immoral, um, because we can interpret those things and rationalize those things in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, were you going to continue?
I guess I would just say it's hard to. I guess it's hard to say that we would be distinct in some way, as though we have some special place in the cosmos with respect to morality, right? Morality is just something that we do. It's an emergent construct, I would say, that arises from our ability to communicate, interact, and model the future.
Yeah, and I would tend to agree with that. I mean, I am a bit of a moral skeptic. I think morality exists, but it exists because we construct it and we use it to navigate our way through the world successfully.
Right.
And we use it also in conjunction with psychology and empathy. And I think it's like empathy, for example, I think is one of the biggest components of morality. Like, if I can't know what it feels like to be punched in the face,
Hmm.
then that's not going to be a veto for me punching you in the face. Like, if if I couldn't see the harm it did to you, then I wouldn't be able to evaluate that as being bad. It's just like almost morally
Right.
neutral. So I end up, punching your face with no problem. In other
Yeah.
words, empathy really is a major component of morality. Is that something you'd agree with?
Right. Yeah. We need to understand some basic facts about the world so that we can accurately model our reality and simulate the future, what will happen. Right. I can take in enough information, even if I've never been punched in the face myself, by seeing other people that, okay, I know that this causes pain, it causes discomfort. People that generally don't like that, right? And then if I do that to somebody, right, I can think about what will happen in the future. If I swing my arm and punch somebody in the face, they're going to feel that discomfort, right? And if I know, okay, I wouldn't like to feel that, right? I should generally treat people in that type of a way, so I can live in a society where we all treat each other in that way, then I know not to be doing that, right? So my ability to understand facts about the world and simulate what will happen when I do something is what allows me to then make those moral judgments and decide, which action to take. And I agree with what you're saying about morality being real. It's just real in a sense, kind of like we could say the president of the United States is real or something, right? It's a real title, it's a real thing, but it's because it's a construct that we've all collectively agreed on, right? If all human beings disappeared right now, the president of the United States would no longer be a thing that exists. I think morality is kind of like the same thing.
And of course, theists don't like that because it means, do you know what? You know, murdering a baby is not objectively wrong, and we get this into this argument of objective morality. And in
Yes.
fact,
Yep.
you get the moral argument, which is a theistic argument that is often used to try and establish a belief in God, because you say, objective moral values exist. Well, they can't exist without a kind of moral lawgiver or whatever, therefore God
Yeah.
type
The,
thing.
the, I think the argument is something like, if objective moral values, or if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist, or something like that, and then
Yeah,
objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. But I think it's a terrible argument. I would disagree with both of the premises right off the bat.
yeah,
Because
because yeah,
the existence of God doesn't solve the problem of objectivity and morality, right? Because either something's moral because it already is, and God just tells you, or God decided it was moral, at which point it's just God's subjective whim or decision that something is moral or not.
exactly, yeah. So you get into uh, the Euthyphro dilemma.
Yep.
So the idea that is it wrong because God said it is wrong, or is it wrong independent of God? And if it's wrong independent of God, you don't need God. And so and that's not really been solved as far as theists are concerned, although they like to think it has been. My simple answer is that there are no abstract ideas. There are no abstract entities. Abstract ideas don't exist. I'm a conceptual nominalist, so we construct abstract ideas ourselves by conceiving of them. And if you have no conceivers, you have no conceptions.
Right.
So if you have no, and if morality is basically an abstract conception, a framework, an abstract framework, then if you don't have the conceivers to understand that or to construct it, then so I don't have a problem saying objective morality doesn't exist. Is it objectively wrong to murder babies? No, it's not. But that doesn't sound as bad as you think it might do. It's because do you know what? When we've all got sound minds, we get together and we talk about these things and we have empathy, then we will come to the conclusion that it is wrong.
Right, exactly. It does not need to be objectively wrong for us to agree that it's wrong. Again, I don't believe in objective morality, but I would gladly say that that doing something like that would be wrong, right? Because I'm coming from a subjective starting point of promoting well-being of conscious creatures and trying to minimize unnecessary harm. Right. And if you can agree on some type of subjective starting point like that, which most people can, it's very easy to get morality off the ground. It doesn't have to be objective in any way. So I think that it's just kind of a waste of time to even spend time squabbling over that, because it's really easy to most people can agree on things like well-being and avoiding unnecessary harm as good starting points to get morality off the ground.
Yeah, I mean, there's something. So in moral philosophy, you quite often talk about non-derivative values, and when you talk about, say, happiness is often used as a great currency for morality in a moral value system, because happiness or pleasure, lack of pain and pleasure are really good because you can't derive them further back. So if I said to you, why did you do that nice thing, right? And you might say, well, I did it because of this. And I say, well, why is that important? Why? And then I keep asking you why. Eventually you're going to get back to something like, well, because it made me happy, or it made them happy, or it made us happy. And I'd say, well,
Right.
why is that good? And you say, because it's good. I can't derive that any further. It's just axiomatically, it's good. Pleasure is good, or happiness is good, right? That's why that's a really good, like you say, that's a really good starting point, like well-being, however you want to define this. And there can be arguments over the nuances there. But this is what I call a non-derivative value, because you can't derive it further. Whereas you could look at something like knowledge, you say, well, why do you want knowledge? And actually you can derive it further. And usually you get back to, well, because it makes the world a happier place if we have knowledge and we blah, blah, blah. But once you get to the happiness bit, you can't derive that further. So that is super, super important. Sorry, it's just going off on one. Let's just talk a little bit about the kind of a naturalistic sense of morality here, and how it is ensconced in the natural world, and look at how, if you believe in God and God designed this system, then it's a bit weird that this is the case. So one example of this might be that I'm going to read you. There's a great book. I advise everyone read this. It's one of the best books I've ever read, by Robert Sapolsky, and it's a huge old book, and it's called Behave. And he says, a final depressing point about inequality and violence. As we've seen, a rat being shot activates a stress response, but a rat being shot to can then bite the hell out of another rat has less of a stress response. Likewise with baboons, if you are low ranking, a reliable way to reduce glucocorticoid secretion is to displace aggression onto those even lower in the pecking order. It's something similar here. Despite the conservative nightmare of class warfare, of the poor rising up to slaughter the wealthy, when inequality fuels violence, it is mostly the poor preying on the poor. And I think it gives an example about walking through an aeroplane. This experience would be done about walking through like first class on an aeroplane. It's more likely to be angrier when you're down. It's all about pecking order. But this is the idea here that that within our natural world, we have a system that's in place that appears to be like, when we get stressed, Like that's really bad. We get stressed because we get crapped on from someone above. And you can talk about this in the workplace with humans,
Hmm.
or you can talk about it with baboons or rats. You get crapped on by the alpha male, and you like one of the best ways to make yourself feel better or less stressed out is to crap on someone else. It's like
Hmm.
you're just passing the issue on down the line. And this is just one of many, 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 many naturalistic components to or biological components to morality or behavior that 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 makes one believe that the naturalism is the best explanation of what's going on. Is there anything you want to add?
No, I think you're exactly right. And again, it points to the kind of physical basis of our cognition, right, and our consciousness and our minds, right. Our mind, I generally tend to view it as the mind is what the brain does, right. And of course, our brains are connected to the rest of our nervous systems, which is linked to the rest of our bodies, right. We take in things like sensory data from our environment. So, then those can be things that stress us out or make us angry, right? Something again like being mistreated at the workplace. Maybe your boss is treating you like crap or something, makes you feel you take in that sensory data, you feel frustrated, upset, whatever, and you find yourself somewhere else, maybe at home after a long day of being treated like crap at work. And what do people do? Maybe they yell at their wife and kids or something, right? We have these physical influences on our cognition that can then influence our behavior, right? Or something like administering a drug to somebody, right? Can influence their behavior and change their behavior patterns and their actions, and maybe cause them to do other things that they wouldn't normally do, right? We've
Which
all
we
heard
we could do. We could do that with drugs and being tired and being hungry. You
Right,
be
I was just gonna
irritable.
say that, right? Everyone knows about people being hangry, right? They get really hungry and then they start acting very irritable and doing things they maybe wouldn't normally do, and then afterward they'll have to be like, "Oh man, I'm really sorry about that. I don't know what came over me." And
Go and
that's kind of
talk
the
to one of
basis
my.
for
Go and
those
talk to
Snickers commercials.
one of my twins. He's like the walking example of hangry at all times. He doesn't really eat. He's got. So yeah, I'm with you there.
Yeah, I think of those Snickers commercials where they're like, "You're not you when you're hungry. Grab a Snickers," right? They're behaving poorly, and then they eat a Snickers, and then they turn back into their normal selves.
But that's interesting because it sounds like a little thing, but actually that's huge, which is to say that our behaviors, our moral behaviors, are influenced by our physiological situation. In fact, there's loads of awesome research to tap into here. So, first of all, there's been research to say that transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is where I think you put magnets near your
Hmm.
brains, if you do that in certain places, I forget what area of the brain, I don't know whether it's the amygdala or what, but you can actually change people's moral evaluations, which is like surely to say that, well, our moral evaluations are therefore function is our brain functioning. It's not so much our mind just thinking about rational things, it's literally the firing in our brains at doing stuff.
Hmm.
So there is that. There is really fantastic. In fact, I'm going to reference this book. I said Behave is one of the best books I've ever read.
Hmm.
This is another one of the best books I've ever read, and it's called The Anatomy of Violence by Adrian Raine. It is absolutely superb, very well thumbed book this. But he's done lots of research himself. In fact, I think this is one of the pieces he did do in Mauritius, which is looking at fear conditioning. So fear conditioning is how well you react to things that should give you fear normally. With skin conductance tests to see like whether you start sweating with your heartbeat and all these kind of things. They do fear conditioning tests of say sort of 3, 4, 5 year olds, I think it is, and then they look at these kids longitudinally and look at them back when they're 21, and the kids that didn't show fear at the age of 5. So literally, you'd be in a normal position, you'd be scared, and they're like, "Yeah, I'm not scared." Those children were overwhelming. You could predict their criminality at the age of 21, which is moral behavior, right? You could predict their criminality at 21 by their fear conditioning tests at 5. And you're like, holy cow. So here we
Hmm.
have a physiological dimension to our moral behavior that follows us through our lives. And then you get into the kind of born evil type thing.
Right. Yeah, and that's true. I mean, there are people who, things like serial killers, who will just say like, "I've felt this way since I was far back as I can remember, since I was a kid." I'm aware of what I'm doing. might be considered wrong, but I can't help it. Like that's just the impulse, right? And so, there is a biological, a genetic basis to the structuring of our brains and the ways that we behave, and that has a huge influence over people's behaviors, right? And the things that we do, irrespective of whether or not someone knows it's more considered to be moral or immoral, right? There are some people that know that, or you could even believe like what I'm doing is immoral. I don't believe it's right, but I have such a strong desire to continue performing this act that's just built into me that I can't resist it, right? Like the urge to take a life or things like that.
It reminds me of, is it Professor Fallon, the guy that did research into the warrior gene, which is a gene that's associated with psychopathy, and he looked at loads of people on death row, and he came up with this theory. It's like, "Oh, it looks like the warrior gene, this particular gene, it has some kind of effect on people's psychopathy," and he did loads of work on that, and it's pretty solid work, and it's well regarded. And then he did his own genetic blueprint, and it turns out that he had the warrior gene, right? And he went back to his wife one night, as so I've seen on the documentary, and he says, "You wouldn't believe it. You know this whole warrior gene I've been doing. It's like it turns out I've got it." And she said, "Yeah, we pretty much figured." Like she said that. Yeah, you've had such a lovely upbringing and a lovely family life, and we've all supported you. But actually, there are elements of your behaviour where I could see in a different situation. And it's that nature nurture like combination that brings about eventual behaviors, right?
Right. Yeah. And there are other even stranger instances where it's very clear that some type of abnormality in the brain leads to a change in behavior that results in a negative outcome. One example I can think of is if you have a capgras delusion. If you're familiar with that, it is essentially an abnormality in the brain that kind of causes a disconnect between the parts of our brain that recognize a human being that we're familiar with and the parts of the brain that have all of our thoughts, feelings, memories, emotions, everything that we associate with that person. So people who have capgras delusion, it's kind of the opposite end of the coin of face blindness. If you're familiar with
Yeah, yeah.
prosopagnosia, yeah, you can't recognize people by their face. When you have a capgras delusion, you can recognize a person. Let's say you see your spouse, you recognize them, but there's a disconnect between all of your emotions and things that you feel about that person, such that you feel this uneasiness. So there used to be kind
Wow.
of a belief of a thing called changelings, if you've ever heard of that. People would believe that it was like a fairy that came and like replaced a loved one, so they were an imposter. And I know of at least one case. I can't remember all the details, but one person killed their spouse because they were convinced that they were an imposter. Right? They were a changeling. They were a very well crafted imposter of their spouse and not the real person because they have a capgras delusion. So you have this negative outcome of somebody being killed because of an abnormality in the brain that changed somebody's behavior, right? And if you truly believe that this is an imposter and they're out to get you, then you can kind of rationalize that behavior. Well, I had to do it, right? This was an imposter. This was something sinister.
Interesting, yeah, and there are so many. Talking about face blindness is interesting because I think that exists on a spectrum as well. So I've known someone who has got that properly, fully, and he is like, I recognize you by your voice or by other
Hmm.
things, and by mannerisms, but not by your face. It's such a weird thing for everyone who's used to having that ability. But then I look at like my partner when we're watching films. I like, oh, that's Jim Smith from this film. Like I've got like an IMDb memory, like, and I'm
Yeah.
just like, and I know faces straight away. So, and one of my twins is like that. The other one, not so much, interestingly. But what my Finn, my boy, is like, he will say, "Oh, that person was in this and that," and I'm like, "Yeah, it was." And my partner sometimes just won't be able to recognize, like, and I just go, how in my head I'm like, how can you not recognize that is this person, like? And so there's she obviously it's not bad, but she just has a different ability to recognize faces. And so when you understand that we all exist on these continua for different skills, then you understand that actually we're going to have different moral calculations, different kind of moral frameworks frameworks or how we apply those moral frameworks that depend upon our brains and our physiology.
Right.
I think.
Exactly. And another thing I wanted to touch on, if you don't mind me quickly shifting
Yeah,
gears here, is something that see sometimes in the atheist, secular community with respect to morality, that always kind of gets on my nerves. And it is this idea that we can use science to derive moral values. And I just want to say that, as someone who's a scientist myself, who's also interested in philosophy, I'm not going to necessarily assume people's motivations, but sometimes it seems like it comes from a place of wanting to um, meet the theists up on their ground, and say, well, you think you can get objective morality. Well, we can actually get objective morality
I
through
think
doing
it's that
science.
desire for objective
Right.
morality. You're right.
When we shouldn't be doing that, right? We shouldn't be trying to do that with science. We should be saying, like, no, we're not actually up here with you, you're down here with us. Nobody can get objective morality. I've seen that quite a few times, right? And there's been works done by that Sam Harris, The Moral Landscape, things like that. I know Michael Shermer has written about it. I was just re-looking at a piece he did on Edge, that what is it, edge.org, I think. Yeah, edge.org. And basically saying that the is ought problem, first introduced by Hume, or popularized by Hume, is fallacious, and science can get us to morality. And I just shake my head when I'm reading something like that, because it's so easy to spot the flaws in a piece of writing. A piece of writing like that. I have the example here. And what Shermer says is, the is-ought problem, sometimes rendered as the naturalistic fallacy, is itself a fallacy. Morals and values must be based on the way things are in order to establish the best conditions for human flourishing. And I'm thinking, well, of course, we need science to tell us how the world is so that we can evaluate the consequences of our actions. But he smuggled in human flourishing as a value, which is subjective. Science cannot tell you that you ought to value human flourishing. You just have to decide that as an axiom.
Yeah, I'd agree. It is based on, of course, it's based on our sense data. Like we're going to base it on, but it doesn't mean that it. Yeah, I think that the word "based on" does a lot of heavy lifting there. But I'd fully agree with you. I remember reading The Moral Landscape. I don't think I actually finished it, maybe because I did have some problems with that. I think Richard Carrier has done quite an interesting, in one of John Loftus's book. He's actually formulated that better than Sam Harris. Um,
Yeah.
but just to go back a little bit, but Mr. Wolf here is really interesting. I struggle to recognize people in movies. It makes it hard when there is a new scene and the character changes clothes, and I think it's a new character introduced into the movie. So there you go. Here it is. People do exist on a continuum there. One other thing I wanted to talk about with regard to, again, moral morality based on, or at least largely affected by physiology, is something called disgust sensitivity in the work of people like David Pizarro, and then people like Jonathan Haidt, who have done political morality and psychology of morality, which is you can affect moral evaluation, particularly in in the social sexual domain, and it doesn't carry across all domains, but with smell, sight, sensations, all sorts of different ways that you can be disgusted. If you prime someone to be disgusted, then they end up having more negative moral evaluations of things. So if
Yep.
someone has a bad smell and they're evaluating homosexuality, for example, or something like that, then they end up evaluating it worse if they've got a bad smell, or stuff like that. Or they even done it where they've got now wash your hands sign, right? And because it's associated with germs and stuff like this, and then there's a negative evaluation of whatever it is they're evaluating. So it's worth looking at the work of Dr. Pizarro, David Pizarro. He's done a really good TED talk on this. But disgust sensitivity predicts whether you're going to be conservative or liberal, interestingly. So it has a political dimension as well. but also your moral evaluation. And so if you start saying, well, God is the moral arbiter, or God is the foundation of morality, you're like, okay, well then God designed and created us all, right? You agree with that? Yeah. So why has he created us in these weird ways that we can explain through evolution? Like, you can explain this in terms of like germs and being disgusted is useful, right? But there's like a bit of confusion going on between your systems of understanding physiological disgust, which is a safety mechanism, don't want to be near disease, death, corpses, stuff like that, and then morally evaluating, right? We can understand it in terms of evolution, but we can't understand it in terms of a perfect designer God. What's going on
Exactly.
there?
Yeah, and I think Jonathan Haidt has used examples before of like asking people, like, do you think it's moral or immoral or amoral to like have sex with a dead chicken or something like that? And some, depending on how disgusted people felt like that some people would say, well, it's immoral, and like, well, why is it immoral? And like, well, I don't know, it just seems wrong. Like, something about it seems wrong because they think of it as disgusting, right? It's not coming from a place of necessarily reasoning your way through it, but having some initial feeling and then post
Right.
hoc rationalizing it, right? Where whether if you took a more calm, rational approach, you could say, well, what are my kind of axioms, starting points here? Something like maximizing well-being, minimizing unnecessary harm. Does having sex with a dead chicken have any type of moral weight with respect to those goals? If it doesn't, then you could say, well, it's not necessarily immoral. I guess you could do it. If you could make a case that maybe it increased your risk for some type of disease that you could communicate to other people, you could say, well, there's a risk of causing harm, so maybe you should try to not do that, something like that. But that's why I think, again, science and reason are important to thinking about moral problems, because we can avoid some of our biases,
Yeah.
but they just can't get morality off
And
the ground in terms of it being objective.
And science will help us know what the best course of action is if we want to achieve certain ends, right? We can look at data and we can say, right, normally when we do this, then this will achieve that end. And normally when we do this, it achieves that outcome. So we can use our scientific knowledge and processes in order to evaluate and work out what the best course of moral action might be. So science is super important for doing morality, or at least, observation and data is of course important. We're not just we don't live in a vacuum. Like, I don't know that you could do morality if you're a brain in a vat, like
Hmm.
that just had no kind of idea of sensation and being able to piece together the world. So it's like these our ideas of morality work in consonance with our experience of the world. Um, but I think to say that as Harris does, that you can that there is some kind of scientific basis to morality in that kind of axiomatic way, I think is problematic. As you say, yes,
Right.
I think we'd all agree that well-being's good, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's like an
Yeah.
objective
You can't
fact.
derive it, using just factual statements alone, right? I don't. That is odd bridge in terms of logic. I've never seen a convincing refutation of that, to my knowledge, and I just don't think that it can be done, because really, you can line up as many factual statements about the world as you want, but in order to tell you what you ought to do, you have to have some type of value statement in the premises of your argument. You can't go from a list of factual premises and then get to an ought conclusion without some type of ought in the premises, right? There are sneaky ways that people have put together arguments that look like you can do it, but or ways that on the surface, if you don't think about it, you might think, oh yeah, you can do it, right? If you say something like, you know, uh, I want a new T-shirt, right? That could be premise one. Your next premise could be, if I want a new T-shirt, um, then I have to go to the store and pay for one. Therefore, I ought to go to the store and pay for a T-shirt, right? So just on the face of it, it kind of seems like, okay, you got from a couple of is statements, factual statements about the world. I want something. This is what I need to do to obtain the thing I want. Therefore, I ought to do that thing, right? But there's a hidden premise there that if you don't list it, you might miss, which would be, I ought to act in such a way as to bring about the things that I would like. So you have to have that premise it needs to be made explicit, in which you would then see there has to be an ought statement in the premises to get to an ought conclusion.
This brings me on to one of my I love this. So in a conditional statement, like an if then statement, you have the protasis and an apodosis, right? These are two parts of the statement. So the protasis is the if I want my car to run well, right? Then, so that's the apodosis, then I need to put oil in my engine, right? If I want my car to run well, then I need to put oil in the engine. But what most people do when they do morality, really, and when they're making moral proclamations, they forget to say the protasis, and they say, oh, you should put oil in your engine. It's like, yeah, okay, but actually it depends. Actually, if I was a scientist doing an experiment on how bad cars can run if you don't put oil in the engine, then I shouldn't put oil in my engine, right? So it depends on the if. So my point here is that everything depends on the if, right? So when you're doing morality, we need to set out what our goals are. I always think morality, like you said earlier, is goal oriented. I just, it's a goal oriented like pastime. Okay, so if I want the world to look like this, then we should do this, or I should do this. Or if I want my house to look like this, or my friendship group to look like this, or if I want my country to, if this, then this. But it's the if part. Now that's a bit where you're doing philosophy, and sometimes it's quite axiomatic, and that you can't necessarily get that bit from the science, and that's what you're saying. So it's the if part. Now the problem is that really when we're doing morality, and sometimes I look at these programs on TV where they're discussing stuff, and they're discussing it up here, right? And like, oh, is it right to torture? Is it wrong to torture in war and whatever? And they're having a debate here, and it's like they haven't done all the moral philosophy, and it's kind of like froth up here. You need to start talking about, and it's often you get back to like, well, what do I want the world to look like? And that's such a difficult conversation. But realistically, the first thing we need to do is like, this is the world that I want to live in. Well, this is what I want the world to look like. Then we should do all this. So that's really difficult.
Yep. Exactly. And a lot of those discussions, they do miss out on touching on the more foundational issue of morality, right? What do we want the world to look like, right? If people are starting out from a different goal, right, they're going to be having different moral assessments and different justifications for the reason that they decided to do or not do a certain thing. And just thinking about how it relates to naturalism and theism, I think it's a very good point against theism is the fact that morality is so difficult. Right now, under theism, morality could be hard in a normative or applied sense. Right, maybe we have a very clear picture of what's good and what's not good, and we just have a hard time behaving. But under theism, what you would generally predict under a model like that is that morality in terms of metaethics, what is right, what's wrong, how do we determine that? That should be a lot more clear than it actually is, right? The way we do morality now is exactly what you would expect under naturalism. It's something that we construct, it's something that's difficult, and it's something that we're never going to fully agree on because we have to come up with subjective, axiomatic starting points to even get it off of the ground.
That's greatly segued me into my next point, but this made me laugh. Thank you, Apocalypse Meow. If we want to support Jonathan M.S. Pearce, then we should buy his books. Mitch Mazerol says very kindly that I just finished The Problem with God, which is this is my that's not my recent book. That's quite an old book, The Problem with God, based on previous writing I've done. So The Problem with God. Yeah. Anyway, great. That's my spam time. Thank you, Mitch. So you were saying, what were you just saying? Because I was going to segue. Oh yeah, that was it. So Paul Draper, I think, makes his argument, and this is going back to evolution, which is evolution has. If God designed the world, right, and if God existed, then you would expect, and if he's using evolution to develop this variety of life, then you would expect when we do morally bad things that we would have bad sensations, right? And if when we're doing morally good things, we'd have good sensations. But actually, it doesn't necessarily accord with that. There are some things that are morally bad that are pleasurable, and some things that are morally good that are painful. and
Mhm.
there's not a correlation there, but it's something that you would expect and can predict and can explain with evolution, but you can't explain actually given a god. And this is one of these abductive arguments, which is on, you got these two hypotheses, naturalistic atheism and supernaturalism. What does evolution and what does pain and pleasure better support, theism or atheism? Do you have anything to say on those kind of evolutionary
Y- y-
correlations?
Yeah, I mean, evolution is a process that occurs in the natural world, right? Species change over time due to different evolutionary mechanisms, and that's what eventually results in something like the human brain that comes with different behaviors, behavioral tendencies, um, responses to different things in terms of what we view as painful or causing pleasure, or what's good or bad. And it makes sense that there would be variation in those things and that we wouldn't fully agree on it, right? In terms of things that feel good and are good, or feel good and are bad, again, with respect to theism, there's different varieties of theism, and under one model maybe something that feels good is good, and under a different theism something that same thing that feels good is bad, right? So they don't all agree on what's good or bad, right? And if you take this monotheistic view, right, if monotheism were true, um, you would much more be much more likely to expect to see a consistent moral standard, right? Understanding what's right or wrong. Something like the Bible, for instance, would you would expect it to be much more clear on morality than it actually is if it were divinely inspired, right? But you have now thousands of denominations of Christianity that don't agree on the morality of the Bible because it's not very clear. It's not there. It contradicts itself at points. It doesn't always take the same view because it's a very human document, right? Comprised of many different books written at different times by different people that had different views on things, which again is completely congruent with the naturalistic view, right? Under naturalism, you would expect religious texts to be human documents, something like a Bible that is a conglomerate of different books written by different people, right? Under theism, you wouldn't. That's not what you would necessarily predict.
No, and I look at the Bible, for example, and I think it fails. I've said this a few times recently. That you look at something like slavery, and it fails so badly on that you can forget the rest of it. I really have got to the point where you don't need to take that book seriously because it failed so badly and obviously on slavery. Like it
Oh
didn't
yeah.
say slavery was bad. By the way, slavery is really bad. We're going to write this in a number of places in this book because it is that
Mhm.
bad. Don't do it, and we're going to be really clear about that. It's no kind of like it's all right
Yeah,
if you capture
if
them
you
in
can
war.
if you can take the time to carve out a section to tell people you shouldn't covet your neighbor's livestock, it shouldn't be very hard to mention that you should not own another human being as property, right? Instead, you get things like Exodus 21 telling you that, well, if you beat your slaves and they don't die and they get up after a few days, it's okay because they're your property, right? Or Leviticus 25 verses 44 through 46 telling you that you can enslave people from the other nations around you and keep them and pass them down to your offspring because they're your personal property, right? You would not expect to see that under the typical theist view. You would definitely expect to see that in a holy book under naturalism.
Yeah, and in fact, as where is it? Where's it gone? Where Hector I've just seen that. Um, anyway, oh yeah, here it is. Apocalypse Meow says Hector Avalos took care of that. So he wrote a book on biblical scholarship and slavery. I've done a book club serialization of that. I haven't actually finished that series yet, but go and check out my videos on Christianity, the Bible, and slavery, where I go to town and go through Hector Avalos, the late Hector Avalos's book
Mhm.
on that. Really good point. So I know that you're only doing a short one tonight due to illness and needing to get a good night's sleep, mate. So we've had a bit of a wander through the weeds of morality. I don't think that for me, the idea is that morality isn't. We don't have a clarity of morality, of moral rules, and we kind of create our moral value systems ourselves, and we argue amongst each other about what those systems are, and let alone what is right or wrong in any given system. We disagree on those systems. And for me, the evidence that is correct, as in some kind of moral skepticism is correct, is the fact that 3,000 years of moral philosophy and no one agrees still. Like, to me, that's like prima facie evidence that, yeah, probably there isn't an objective moral value. And even if there is, we've got an epistemic barriers to be able to access what that, like, if you believe in objective morality, naturalistically, that it exists somewhere out there, we've still got the job of trying to find it, and we're still exactly in the same place. And if you believe that God grounds subjective morality, which God? How do we know we've got the right God? How do we know we've interpreted that God's commands correctly?
Right.
So on and so forth. So we still get the same problems, that we're still evaluating those things ourselves.
Yes, it's exactly right, and that's goes back to kind of what I had said, that you can't solve any of the problems inherent in moral philosophy or doing morality by appealing to theism, because you introduce a whole suite of problems in and of itself, right? Like you were saying, which God is it? How do we know? How can we identify them? Even if you could, in principle, do that, how could you then know that you have the commands correct, right? You're interpreting them correctly, that you're doing the right thing, right? Without being able to actually demonstrate the existence of such a being and be able to communicate it in a convincing way, it really does nothing to advance morality, because you can always just say, well, how do you know, right? How do you know that this holy book is God's word or has the correct commands? Or if you point out contradictions, well, how do I know which one of these to follow, right? So you just don't
And
solve any of those
but the
problems.
way you do that, of course, is by doing moral reasoning, right? The way you
Right.
go, but this is, I don't want to make this about divine command theory, but divine command theory is the moral value system that what God commands is true, is moral, right? And but then you can't defer to moral reasoning, because if you do that, then it's moral reasoning that grounds morality and not God. So it's good, it needs to be
Right.
God's commands, but you end up having commands that are devoid of moral reasoning. And then you say to the Christian, you say, yeah, but God commanded rape in the Bible. And then
Hmm.
the Christian says, no, God didn't command rape. God wouldn't command rape. Well, and then you say, and then you get them in to catch you. You say, well, why wouldn't God command rape? And they say, well, because it's wrong. So you just wouldn't command that. It's like, well, how do you know it's wrong if God, like, you're getting into a circular argument here. It's like you've assumed it's wrong because you assume God wouldn't command, but you're using moral reasoning to say rape is wrong, and therefore God wouldn't command it.
Right.
You
Yeah.
cannot do that.
And that's kind of one of the classic problems that is always put forward in atheist versus theist debates. Is you always get somebody saying, well, what if God tomorrow said that it was moral to start committing murder, right? Would you do it? Or they'll point out something immoral that God supposedly commanded, like in the Bible, right? And you always get the responses of either he didn't do that, you're wrong, you're not interpreting it correctly, or he wouldn't do that, right? He would never do that. It's against his nature to permit murder or something. um he didn't do that, he wouldn't do that, or if he did, then there's just some reason behind it that's really good that we just can't understand, right? But then again, that's kind of assuming that what's good is things that are promoting well-being, health, and avoiding unnecessary harm, and that causing unnecessary harm could never be moral, even if God commanded it. Or else he could, but he wouldn't, because he thinks it's immoral or something like that. But you're not solving that problem of grounding morality by appealing to theism because of those problems.
You're always still going to need to do moral reasoning. In the absence of that God coming and telling you all the time what is right and what is wrong, you're just going to have to do moral reasoning. And so, yeah, thank you so much, Mitch. Great guest and a pleasant meandering through the weeds of morality. Thanks for making this stream happen. I really appreciate that, Mitch. You're such an awesome person. Need to get you on again, Mitch. Actually, we'll have a chat. But this is my favorite comment of the night. It's Carrie Ann Chrysler. She says, my mum took us to church because I was a weird child. I don't know why I find that funny. Just find that funny. I'm sure you weren't a weird child. It's just the rest of the world is weird and you're all right by me. So Austin, thank you for just basically having a chat about morality. We haven't solved the world, we haven't, but there's plenty more to talk to, and plenty of different places we could go. I would
Definitely.
advise people to get an anatomy of violence, and also get Behave by Robert Sapolsky. It's such a good book.
Definitely.
Do you have any sort of a couple of things. First of all, are there any other books that you would recommend that might be good for people to read on subjects concerning this? And also, how do you do morality, like on a daily, practical basis?
Yeah. Wow. There's a lot of stuff. I guess there's a lot of things that you could read out there. In terms of what's really readily accessible, easy to pick up. Again, I would go back to Sean Carroll's The Big Picture. There's a lot about morality toward the end of that. I'm always going to recommend that book. I think that would be a great one. If you are willing to really dive into the weeds and go through something that's a little more long and dry, I would go for some Hume. A treatise on human nature. It's a good one to read, although long. And as much as I love Hume, he was a very clear thinker, but not exactly the clearest writer, I guess I would say.
I thought you were going to say that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a challenge to read. Tends to write kind of long, drawn out sentences, not always make his point in the clearest way. Sometimes he'll make his points through jokes or, dialogues between people, right? Where the point is kind of buried in the dialogue between characters, right? Like if you ever read his dialogues concerning natural religion, right? He's making arguments and points about theism, but doing it through the interaction of a few characters that he made up, right? It's not like a philosophical text where he's laying out premises and conclusions. Again, I enjoy Hume. I would recommend reading some of his works. Another interesting piece from him is called On Suicide. It's about the morality of suicide. Some very interesting work. So, read Hume. I would recommend doing that. In terms of doing morality, it's hard. It's very hard to do. I'm certainly make mistakes all the time. But I think what's important is to try to do your best, right? And we can understand that we have these
But
kind of
what is your best?
foundational, right? I think your best is trying to achieve the desired outcomes and perform actions that are consistent with the kind of axioms that you've chosen, right? Like for myself, I think of minimizing unnecessary harm, maximizing happiness and well-being amongst myself and the people that I care about, and trying not to cause harm, right? Or unnecessary harm, right? Sometimes you might have to cause some harm for a reason that is ultimately good or something, right? Maybe your child doesn't want to get a procedure done at the doctor's or something, but they need it, right? It might cause them some pain or discomfort, but ultimately it's bringing about a better outcome, right? So in terms of doing morality, it's really thinking about the situation you're in, and we all have competing demands, and we have to juggle and decide what we're going to do every day. It's kind of evaluating the actions that we are going to take or that we have taken, and seeing how they relate to the goal or value or axiom that we have, and trying to be consistent with that.
And I think, and thank you so much, Ricky Johnson, who is Austin Johnson's dad, watching. I've had him on a couple of times. Fascinating discussion, really enjoyable. Thanks so much for that. That's really generous. And Arus, thank you. Glad I was able to listen live. Thank you both for your great work. Love the discussion on morality. Really appreciate all the super chats. It's absolutely fabulous. And talk about what, of course, someone might come and say, well, what your idea of best is not necessarily what someone else's idea is, and you'll have different intentions or different and I guess it gets down to like, what is the kind of world that you want to live in, and what is the kind of world that someone else wants to live in? What are the differences there? And then arguing about why one person's world idea of what the world should look like is better or worse than this other person. So this is where we get onto moral philosophy, and it will be about arguing over those axioms and arguing over what the better world is. But at some point, axioms you can't. Like, axioms are supposed to be self-evident truths, which means you can't like ground them in further. They're non-derivative themselves,
Yep.
so it's difficult to establish an axiom. It's just true.
It's just
So argue.
true. Yep. And I think that, well-being is a very good axiom and a good place to start. And it's kind of part of our, built into our human nature, right? We can convince people. People will um, generally tend to kind of sign on to the well-being, and a lot of people, some will kind of implicitly view morality through that lens, whether they realize they're doing it or not, right? So some of it just comes back down to getting down to your starting point, and if somebody disagrees with you, trying to kind of get them to sign on to well-being as an axiom or a starting point.
Indeed, and and that's why someone like Sam Harris wants to take well-being and go with that. But whether it is like an just an ought, or whether it's like, well, we're going to assume it's how it should be because it just seems beneficial to that. But I'm
Right.
just doing a bit of philosophy to do that. Or it's subjective at least to do that rather than being objectively true, because the universe isn't interested in us flourishing, in the well-being
Yep.
of humanity necessarily. So that's us that's constructing like well-being being the thing we should aim for. Well-being is great, and then we can argue, well, is that the well-being of animals as well? Is that in our best interest, and biodiversity, and then you get ecology and environmentalism and all this kind of stuff that you are super interested in? But then I guess that's stuff for another conversation. But I know you need to get on now, mate. Thank you so much to Anna Roos, to Ricky Johnson, to Mitch Mazarol. You are all just basic legends. You're it's just axiomatically true that you're awesome. And thank you, Carrie and Chrysler says, I love Jonathan and Austin chatting back and forth. It's always great conversation to be gifted hearing. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Any last words, mate?
Well, I guess the last thing I would say is that morality it's difficult, it's messy, it's muddy, it's not objective, and we need to be open-minded and be willing to have discussions with one another and listen. And you can't derive ought from is, so don't make that mistake. Don't waste your time trying to develop or argue for or develop an idea of some objective morality. I think it's better to be honest and admit that it is something that we have to do. It does require some subjectivity, some brute facts or an axiom, some starting point that's subjectively chosen. But we do that with many other things in our day-to-day life. We do things like we play sports or games where we have these subjectively decided upon rules, like a game of basketball or baseball or chess, right? And if we can all agree that these are the rules that we're going to play by, we can make objective assessments about what we ought to do, right? If we subjectively come up with the rules to a chess game and we know that we want to win the game, I can now make ought statements about what I should do. And morality is the same thing, right? We need to have discussions and come together and decide what the axioms are that we're going to use to get morality off the ground so that we can decide what to do.
This is I mean, this is fascinating. Like, I'm trying to end this, but you just make me want to talk about more stuff. But this is where like morality and politics. So politics is just morality writ large. It's like we talk about morality usually in individual ways. Politics is just like how we ought to run countries or the world. And so therefore what you're talking about is, we get together, we agree what's the right thing to do. And politics is then trying to extrapolate that across society, which is like vote in the people that agree that that's the right thing to do. So we need a functioning democracy, then we need knowledge, and then in order to get, so morality involves like discussions of morality, then like expand to discussions of politics, discussions of education, discussions of empathy, knowledge about impacts of things, science, like is this the right thing, how do I know what the impact of this is on people around the world, and blah blah blah. And so, you know, for us to be fully functioning moral creatures, we need all of these things to be working really well together, and it's just bloody difficult, as you say, but there you go, don't give up trying. And your mum's involved, so thanks. Super sticker from A Johnson, legend. Thank you, Johnson family, you are amazing. But particularly on this this time, Austin, look, we'll have to, if you fancy it, I don't know what subject we can broach next time, or maybe delve further into some area of morality or evolution or whatever. You're always welcome on. It's always a pleasure, never a chore. And thank you so much for everyone else in the live chat, and for you watching this. Really appreciate you being here with us, and for the super chats. Thank you, and tune in. I'm hopefully going to get some more interviews lined up in the next coming weeks, but look out for Austin back on the channel at some point, where we'll just shoot the breeze about something.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on. I love to come on and chat.
No worries, man. Always a pleasure. Cool. Okay, take care, and see you soon, Austin.
See ya.